Today I'll be diving into the core of Enneagram 9 and giving a general breakdown on the true depth of this character, depth that makes them more than just a peacemaker.
See, I'm what you would call a serial people pleaser. I live to please anybody but myself. I have this insufferable need to be liked, and I've done the analysis. I think it's a survival instinct to be liked. See, if you don't like me, I will die. And that is what all of this leads to, you know? See, belonging and being liked, it feels good because it feels like surviving. I developed this sense of death and belonging as a kid, because if I didn't win someone's approval, then I wouldn't be fed, I wouldn't be hugged, I wouldn't be comfortable, and if I didn't have those things, I died. If I didn't stop crying, I died. If I said no, I die. Giving your life away to the whims and approval of other people, it never looks like much. It happens very slowly. Sure, absolutely, fine, no worries. No, that's okay, ignore me, I agree. I'm fine, nothing's wrong. I'm fine.
Claudio Naranjo identified nines as something called sloth, or a better term would be spiritual amnesia. Sloth is not idleness of the body, but idleness of the soul. Naranjo preferred the original term acedia, which is a Greek word meaning without care, which he found more fitting for the nine's passion of refusing to look inward. And that, to Naranjo, was the tragedy of the nine, that they forget their own forgetting. More than just tuning out emotions, they forget they ever mattered to begin with. And to survive, they trade authenticity for comfort. This sloth manifests as a loss of interiority, a resistance to change, and a deadening of feelings. Dorothy Sayers describes it as a poisoning of the will that begins with indifference and ends in despair. Type 9s become numb to frustration through an oversimplification of life and stoic withdrawal, becoming psychologically thick-skinned. If the passion of type 9 is sloth, a spiritual refusal to be, the fixation is indolence. This is the quiet habit of postponement, of waiting for life to act upon them instead of acting on life themselves. Indolence is the postponement of living, a subtle inertia not only towards self-examination, but towards everything not immediately necessary. Again, this doesn't mean type 9s are lazy in the practical sense. 9s can be very hardworking, they can show up for others and maintain stability, but they won't move unless they have to. Not just emotionally, but existentially. They may not buy a car, not because they can't, but because they don't feel like they need to. They've adapted so deeply to having little desire, they no longer notice what's missing. One example Naranjo gives is of a conservation 9 who rode a moped everywhere. Only when it broke down and their sister gave them a car did they finally transition, because change had to find them. That's indolence, this passively waiting for outer necessity to override inner resignation. If no one pushes me, I'll keep doing this, and it's fine. But nothing meaningful can grow from just being fine. Indolence delays action and transformation. And until a crisis breaks their inertia, the 9 may never know how long they've been asleep. Rather than face discomfort, 9s will prefer to numb themselves through a process called narcotization, or what Naranjo calls self-distraction and a loss of interiority. Some examples you'll see this in are overeating, TV binges, getting overly involved in helping others, smiling away conflict, or changing the subject when emotions arise. Gestalt therapist Polster calls this deflection, avoiding intensity with distraction. And beneath this nice exterior is often an exhausted spirit. As Naranjo says, they resemble someone who died long ago but continues smiling out of habit. Quote, not wanting to see, not wanting to be in touch with one's experience is something akin to cognitive laziness, an eclipse of the experiencer, or inner witnessing in the person. In line with such eclipse of cognition, in the light of a predominantly active disposition, is a trait that may be called concretism, the expression of which ranges from literalness to an excessively earthbound attitude. a Sancho Panza-esque concern for survival and practicality, at the expense of the subtle and the mysterious, a loss of openness to the unexpected and to the spirit. One of the most common traits in a Type 9 is over-adaptation. Naranjo would say they are too good for their own good, as they believe asserting themselves will create chaos, so they resign, and eventually they start believing they don't have desires at all. Quote, if in the case of the failure to embody the ideal of loving one's neighbor as oneself comes from loving oneself more than one's neighbor, in Enneatype 9, the situation appears as the opposite, for the over-adjusted postpone their own good and the satisfaction of their needs in an excessive yieldingness to the demands and needs of others. Excessive adaptation to the world would be too painful to endure without self-forgetfulness. Resignation in the Type 9 is a deep-seated giving up on asserting personal needs and desires. Nines believe that asserting themselves would cause rupture and chaos, and would lead to abandonment or rejection. And over time, this reinforces their identification with passivity. Quote, both self-alienation and abnegated over-adaptation involve resignation, a giving up on oneself, an abdication from oneself and from life. It's as if the individual endorsed a strategy of playing dead to stay alive, yet becoming tragically dead in life in the name of life. Though resignation underlies over-adaptation, it deserves to be considered by itself in view of the prominence of traits involving laziness in regard to one's needs, contentedness, and giving up, or not standing up for one's rights. On fusion and boundary loss, this is what Gestalt psychologists called confluence, a boundary disturbance where the 9 emotionally merges with others. This creates dependency, people-pleasing, and self-erasure. And the fear of separation or disagreement is what drives this. Confluence blocks differentiation and autonomy, and when fusion fails, 9s may retreat into depressive inertia or passive hostility. Another psychological mechanism that's particularly prominent in Type 9 is one which Kaiser postulated as a root of all emotional disturbances and described as a fantasy of fusion, and as an unrealistic carryover into the adult life of the early symbiotic relationship with the mother. The concept is echoed in Gestalt therapy, with confluence being described as a boundary disturbance, but could be called a defense mechanism just as well, inasmuch as it constitutes an attempt to reject from awareness the fact of one's isolation, aloneness, and individuality. Type 9s become governed by the mechanical. Their life narrows into predictable behaviors, habits, schedules, routines that suppress friction. Naranjo calls this robotization, a defensive ritualization of life to avoid inner disturbance. They're not obsessed with efficiency like a Type 3, nor are they ruled by anxiety like a Type 6. The motivation for this is the avoidance of inner confrontation. This robotic functioning appears calm, but is a strategy to deaden the psyche. They embed themselves in the comfort of routines to resist waking up, and this stillness can be mistaken as centeredness, when in reality it's a desperate attempt to avoid the pain they feel inside. This resistance to change makes them rigid, and sometimes they can even become defiant. Quote, the over-adjusted are creatures of habit. They're bound by customs and regularity. From Sheldon's observations of viscerotonics in general, they're excessively concerned with the preservation of their balance. As a corollary, they tend to be conservative and tradition-directed to the point of rigidity. The same trait of psychological inertia may be thought to underlie an excessive attachment to the familiar, to the group norms, or how things are done. For 9s, generosity often appears selfless, helpful, and even saintly, but their care is rarely rooted in pure abundance. These acts of care often carry a hidden longing for connection, but it's so deeply buried, even they don't see it. This unconscious bargain, I'll take care of you, so I can exist in your life, leads to covert expectations, and later, resentment. This is not to seduce, but to survive. A childlike strategy to earn belonging without asking for it directly. Their selflessness is real, but it's born of suppression, not fullness. They give to be needed, but deny that they need to be loved. Beneath their selflessness is a neglected hunger for recognition, and this unconscious bargain can become burdensome for others, and the last thing the 9 would want to feel is that they've become a burden. Quote, "It would seem that such agility is part of an attitude of taking oneself lightly in order to not weigh upon others, just as friendliness is supported by the ability to be for the other more than for oneself." The Type 9's core childhood wound is abandonment, not through violence, but through emotional neglect or burden, or at least this is what's typically reported. Naranjo highlights some recurring dynamics: a passive, resigned father, often a Type 9 himself, and a critical, overbearing mother, often Type 1 or 4. And many 9s report being parentified, expected to be calm, quiet, good, and undemanding. They learned to keep the peace by disappearing. They weren't necessarily unloved, but they were unseen. Quote, "I had no choice but to adapt" is a frequent refrain. They became what the family needed, and not who they were. In doing so, they severed from their own desires, learning that expressing themselves would only cause rupture. This is the child that was forced to grow up too early, to throw away their needs to take care of others. And this core wound, this childhood strategy, is what reinforces that selflessness is a virtue and selfishness is to be demonized. Quote, "It's often clear from childhood circumstances that there was not another way out for the child than yielding to circumstances. Sometimes it wasn't that the mother's warmth was lacking, but circumstances prevented her from being more available, and the child perceived that complaining or calling attention to oneself would be of no help. On other occasions, the child feels in a precarious position in the family, and this gives a sense that by complaining, one might lose what little one has." Some of Naranjo's constitutional observations on the 9 should be taken with a grain of salt. He noticed that the body's demeanor of the 9 often mirrored their inner stance: slow movements, soft features, relaxed postures. And this is what Sheldon referred to as viscerotonic: warm, peace-seeking, comfort-orientated. And this softness wasn't just about temperament, but was a complete resignation of the body. Energy is often dulled or misdirected towards mundane survival. A quick rundown on the 3 faces of Sloth. All 9 share the central theme of spiritual inertia and self-forgetting, but each subtype expresses this differently. For the Conservation 9, they distract themselves with food, objects, or routine. They can often be mistaken for the strong and self-sufficient Enneagram 8, but they lack the assertiveness and the belief in going out and taking from the world. This 9 is more openly irritable than the other 2 subtypes, and anger comes out as stubbornness or passive aggression. The fantasy life is concrete and physical, focused on hoarding and survival. As Naranjo would say, he survives pain by filling a void with cravings. And their blind spot is that they think they can do everything alone, that they can be completely independent, and avoid the fear of rejection and abandonment. For the Social 9, this is the more dutiful, externally vibrant, but internally absent 9. They typically look the happiest, smiling, active, and helpful. They feel alive by escaping into group work or social causes, but their actions are disconnected from any real desire. And they may resemble a Type 3, but they lack the drive for success. And they lose themselves in being useful. Burnout for them is more emotional than physical. For the Sexual 9, Naranjo might say the self-erasing romantic idealist, focused on merging. This 9 embodies fusion more than the other 2 9s. Their focus is on fusing with a partner to avoid emptiness. They become emotionally dependent, but they're not aware of it. This is the most reserved, dreamy, and deeply tender of the 9s. The most prone to fantasy, especially romantic or melancholic, and can often mistype as a 4 because of this. He cries and feels others' pain, but is blind to his own. Their love is selfless in appearance, but hides a silent, unmet need to exist. For nines, the journey is about learning not to become someone else, but to wake up and find who they are, to stop trading authenticity for comfort, and learn that stillness is only peaceful when it comes from presence. This was mostly a general breakdown of the core, but in a later video, I'll go more in depth on each subtype.